When Sarah Mitchell first saw the flames crawling up the walls of the abandoned warehouse, she thought about her daughter waiting at home for bedtime stories. She thought about the wedding ring in her pocket that she planned to return to her ex-husband tomorrow. She thought about a lot of things, but dying wasn't one of them. What Sarah didn't know was that 3 blocks away, a man she'd never met was about to make a choice that would change everything. Lieutenant Commander Jake "Ghost" Ramirez had been out of active duty for exactly 47 days. But some instincts never fade. When you've spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL, you don't just walk past burning buildings. You definitely don't walk past burning buildings when you hear someone screaming for help from inside. This is the true story of what happens when ordinary evil meets extraordinary courage. It's about a woman who refused to give up, and a warrior who couldn't walk away. Most importantly, it's about learning that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the darkest moments, and that fire might consume buildings, but it can't stop the human spirit. The warehouse fire on East Industrial Boulevard should have been just another insurance claim, another tragic accident in a neighborhood that had seen too many. Instead, it became the night that proved some people are simply too stubborn to die, and others are too honorable to let them try. Sarah Mitchell had always been careful about taking shortcuts through bad neighborhoods, but tonight was different. Tonight, she was running on 3 hours of sleep, 2 cups of coffee, and one very bad decision to work a double shift at the diner. The GPS on her phone had died somewhere around 5th Street, and now she was walking through an area of the city that most people avoided even in broad daylight. The warehouse district stretched out before her like a concrete graveyard. Empty buildings with broken windows stared down at her from both sides of the street. Graffiti covered most of the walls, and the occasional streetlight flickered like dying candles. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter and quickened her pace. She just needed to get through this area and catch the bus on the other side. Then, she could go home to her apartment, kiss her sleeping daughter goodnight, and pretend this day had never happened. What Sarah didn't notice was the black sedan that had been following her for the past 4 blocks. The men inside had been watching her for weeks, learning her routines, waiting for the right moment. They knew she walked home from work every Tuesday and Thursday when her car was in the shop. They knew she took the shortcut through the warehouse district when she was running late. Most importantly, they knew that nobody would miss her for at least 8 hours, maybe more. The sedan pulled ahead and parked behind a dumpster. 3 men got out, their footsteps echoing off the empty buildings. Sarah heard them before she saw them, and by then, it was too late to run. "Excuse me, miss," the first man called out, his voice carrying a false politeness that made Sarah's skin crawl. "We're a little lost. Could you help us with directions?" Sarah stopped walking but didn't turn around. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run, but her legs felt like concrete. She could hear them getting closer, their footsteps deliberately slow and threatening. "I'm sorry, I'm not from around here," she said without looking back, trying to keep walking. "There's a gas station about 6 blocks that way. They'll have maps." The second man moved faster than she expected. One moment she was walking toward what she hoped was safety, and the next moment someone had grabbed her arm and spun her around. She found herself looking at 3 men in expensive suits, their faces hidden by shadows and the brims of baseball caps. "That's not very friendly," the man holding her arm said. His grip was tight enough to leave bruises. "We just want to talk." Sarah tried to pull away, but the third man had already moved behind her, cutting off any escape route. She looked around frantically, hoping to see another person, a police car, anything that might help. But the street was empty except for abandoned buildings and broken dreams. "What do you want?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "We want you to understand something," the first man said, stepping closer. "Your ex-husband owes some people money. A lot of money. And when someone doesn't pay their debts, sometimes innocent people get hurt." Sarah's blood turned cold. David. Her ex-husband David had been involved with gambling again, despite all his promises. Despite the divorce, despite her threats to keep him away from their daughter if he didn't clean up his life. Somehow, his problems had found their way to her. "I don't have anything to do with David's debts," she said, trying to sound stronger than she felt. "We've been divorced for 2 years. Whatever he owes, that's his problem." The man holding her arm squeezed harder. "See, that's where you're wrong. David seems to think his problems are everyone else's problems. He told our boss that maybe you'd be willing to help him out. Maybe you'd be motivated to find the money if something happened to remind you how dangerous it is to ignore your obligations. They started walking, and Sarah realized with growing horror that they were heading toward one of the abandoned warehouses. The building loomed ahead of them like a concrete monster, its broken windows staring down at her like dead eyes. Rust stains ran down the walls like dried blood, and weeds grew through cracks in the foundation. "Please," she said, stumbling as they forced her forward. "I work at a diner. I make minimum wage plus tips. I don't have the kind of money you're talking about." "We know exactly what you make." The third man spoke for the first time, his voice flat and emotionless. "We know where you work, where you live, what school your daughter goes to. We know everything about you, Sarah Mitchell." The mention of her daughter made something fierce and desperate rise up in Sarah's chest. These men had been watching her, following her, learning about her life. They knew about Emma, her 5-year-old daughter who was probably asleep right now, waiting for her mother to come home. "Leave my daughter out of this," she said, finally, finding some strength in her voice. "She's just a child." "Children are very motivating," the first man said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Amazing how much people will do to protect their children. Your ex-husband is about to learn that lesson." They reached the warehouse, and Sarah saw that the main entrance had been pried open. The metal door hung at an odd angle, and darkness waited beyond the threshold like a hungry mouth. The men pushed her forward, and she stumbled into the building. The inside of the warehouse was worse than the outside. The air smelled of rust, mold, and something else that Sarah didn't want to identify. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, and she could hear the scurrying of rats in the corners. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the walls, making the empty space look like something from a nightmare. "Here's what's going to happen," the first man said, pulling out his phone. "We're going to call your ex-husband. We're going to tell him exactly where you are and exactly what will happen to you if he doesn't come up with our money by tomorrow night. Then, we're going to leave you here to think about how important it is to pay your debts on time." "You can't just leave me here," Sarah said, looking around at the vast empty space. "This building isn't safe. The floors are rotting, the walls are crumbling." "That's kind of the point," the second man said. "Motivation works better when there are real consequences." The third man had been busy while they talked. He'd pulled several containers from a bag and was spreading something around the entrance to the building. The smell hit Sarah a moment later, sharp and chemical. "Gasoline." "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice rising toward panic. "Insurance," the first man said, dialing his phone. "David needs to understand that this isn't a game. When he gets our call and realizes where you are, he'll have exactly 12 hours to bring us our money. If he doesn't, well, old buildings like this catch fire all the time." Sarah watched in growing horror as the man with the gasoline continued spreading it around the entrance, soaking the old wooden pallets and debris that littered the floor. The fumes made her eyes water, and she realized that they weren't bluffing. They really intended to leave her here, trapped in a building that they could set on fire at any moment. "Please," she said, backing away from the entrance. "I have a little girl. She needs her mother." "Then, you better hope your ex-husband cares more about you than he does about his gambling habit," the first man said, connecting his call. "David?" "Yeah, it's Marcus. We need to talk." Sarah listened to the one-sided conversation with growing dread. Marcus explained where she was, what would happen if David didn't pay, and how much time he had to come up with the money. Through it all, his voice remained calm and businesslike, as if he were discussing a grocery list instead of threatening someone's life. When he hung up, Marcus looked at Sarah with something that might have been sympathy. "He sounded surprised," he said. "Apparently, he really thought this wouldn't affect you. Funny how people convince themselves that their choices don't hurt the people they love." The three men walked toward the entrance, leaving Sarah standing alone in the middle of the warehouse. She started to follow them, but the second man turned back and showed her a lighter. "I wouldn't follow us if I were you," he said. "The fumes from the gasoline are pretty thick right by the door. One spark, and this whole place goes up like a Roman candle. Better to stay back here where it's safe." "For now," the third man added. They left her there, and Sarah heard the sound of a chain and padlock being attached to the outside of the door. She was trapped in an abandoned warehouse, surrounded by gasoline fumes, with no way out, and no way to contact anyone for help. Her phone had no signal this deep in the warehouse district, and she had no idea if anyone would even think to look for her here. Sarah sank to the floor and tried not to cry. She thought ABA Lieutenant Commander Jake Ramirez hadn't slept well in 47 days. Not since he'd come home from his last deployment. Not since he'd traded his tactical gear for civilian clothes and his mission briefings for therapy appointments. The Navy doctors said he needed time to adjust, that it was normal for special operations personnel to struggle with the transition back to everyday life. They said a lot of things that sounded true in theory, but felt like lies when he was lying awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and listening for threats that weren't there. Tonight was worse than usual. Jake had given up on sleep around midnight and decided to take a walk through the city. Walking helped sometimes, gave his restless energy somewhere to go. His therapist would probably call this healthy coping behavior or some other clinical phrase that made it sound like progress instead of just another way to avoid dealing with the fact that he didn't know how to be a regular person anymore. The warehouse district wasn't exactly a tourist destination, but Jake found something peaceful about the empty streets and abandoned buildings. It reminded him of some of the places he'd been deployed, urban areas that had been evacuated or forgotten. There was an honesty to abandoned places, a clarity that you couldn't find in the crowded, complicated world of ordinary civilian life. Jake had been walking for about an hour when he noticed the black sedan parked behind a dumpster. It was the kind of detail that most people would overlook, but 8 years in special operations had trained him to notice things that didn't belong. The car was too clean for this neighborhood, too expensive. The windows were tinted dark enough to hide the people inside, and it was positioned in a way that gave the occupants a clear view of the street while keeping them hidden. Surveillance position, his mind cataloged automatically. Professional setup, not random. Jake slowed his pace and pretended to check his phone while he observed the sedan. He could see movement inside, at least 2 people, possibly 3. They were watching something or someone, waiting. The back of Jake's neck started to itch, the way it always did when a situation was about to go sideways. He was about to move on when he saw the woman walking down the street. She was small and tired-looking, carrying herself with the careful alertness of someone who knew she was in a dangerous area, but didn't have any other choice. Jake recognized the body language immediately. Civilian, isolated, vulnerable. Target. The sedan's engine started. Jake's training kicked in before his conscious mind had time to analyze the situation. He ducked into the shadow of a nearby building and activated the tactical mindset that had kept him alive through 8 years of the world's most dangerous missions. Observe, assess, act. The first rule of special operations: gather intelligence before making decisions. The sedan pulled ahead of the woman, and 3 men got out. Jake couldn't hear their conversation from his position, but he could read their body language clearly enough. Aggressive postures, coordinated movement, systematic positioning to cut off escape routes. This wasn't a mugging or a random crime of opportunity. This was a planned operation. Jake pulled out his phone and started to dial 911, then stopped. The police response time in this area would be at least 10 minutes, probably longer. By the time they arrived, whatever was happening would be over. The woman would be gone, and there would be nothing left but empty streets and unanswered questions. He watched as the men forced the woman toward one of the abandoned warehouses. She was fighting them, trying to pull away, but they were bigger and stronger and clearly experienced in handling unwilling subjects. Jake counted 3 hostiles, 1 civilian in immediate danger. Standard rescue scenario, except he wasn't part of a unit anymore. He didn't have backup, he didn't have authorization, and he definitely didn't have the legal authority to intervene in what might be a civilian law enforcement matter. On the other hand, he'd taken an oath to defend the innocent, and some oaths didn't expire just because you changed jobs. Jake followed at a distance, using the shadows and debris for cover. The warehouse they were heading toward was a perfect location for whatever they had planned. Isolated, soundproof, multiple entry and exit points. If someone wanted to hurt the woman or hold her against her will, they couldn't have picked a better place. He watched them disappear into the building and waited. 5 minutes later, the three men emerged without the woman. Jake saw one of them attach a chain and padlock to the door, trapping her inside. Then, he saw the second man pull out several containers and start spreading something around the entrance. The smell of gasoline reached Jake a moment later, and, suddenly, the situation became crystal clear. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was a setup for murder, made to look like an accident. Someone wanted the woman dead, but they wanted it to appear that she'd been trapped in a building that caught fire. Insurance fire. Clean, professional, almost impossible to prove as anything other than terrible luck. The men got back into their sedan and drove away, leaving the woman locked in a building that was now soaked with accelerant. Jake didn't need to be a demolitions expert to understand what came next. Sometime soon, probably after they'd made whatever phone calls or demands they needed to make, they would come back and drop a match. The building would go up like a bonfire, and by the time the fire department arrived, there would be nothing left but ashes and charred bones. Jake had about 30 seconds to make a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could call the police, report what he'd seen, and hope that someone official would be able to organize a rescue operation before it was too late. Or he could do what he'd been trained to do for the last 8 years of his life, and handle the situation himself. The first option was safer, legal, and followed all the proper protocols for civilian emergencies. The second option was dangerous, potentially illegal, and definitely outside his authority as a retired military officer. It was also the only option that guaranteed the woman would still be alive at the end of the night. Jake had spent 47 days trying to figure out how to be a regular person. Tonight, he decided to stop trying. He approached the warehouse like he was entering a hostile building in enemy territory. Slow, careful, watching for tripwires or alarms. The main entrance was chained shut and reeked of gasoline, but warehouses this size always had multiple access points. Fire codes required it, and even abandoned buildings usually maintained some of their original safety features. Jake circled the building, testing doors and windows, looking for a way in that wouldn't involve walking through accelerant. On the north side of the warehouse, he found what he was looking for, a loading dock with a roll-up door that hadn't been properly secured. The lock was broken, and the door was hanging slightly askew. Jake was able to lift it just enough to create a gap he could slide under. The inside of the warehouse was dark as a tomb and twice as quiet. Jake pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight, keeping the beam low to avoid creating shadows that might give away his position. Old habit. Even though the hostiles were gone, stealth was always better than noise when you were operating in unfamiliar territory. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Is someone in here?" He heard movement from somewhere ahead, footsteps on concrete, and the sound of someone breathing hard. Jake followed the sounds, moving carefully through the maze of abandoned machinery and debris. His flashlight beam swept across rust-stained walls and puddles of stagnant water. "Who's there?" A woman's voice called back, shaky but determined. "Stay away from me." "My name is Jake," he called back, stopping where he was. "I saw what happened outside. I'm here to help you get out of this building." There was a long pause, and Jake could hear the woman moving around, probably trying to position herself somewhere she could see him without being trapped if he turned out to be another threat. "How do I know you're not with them?" she finally asked. "Because if I was with them, I wouldn't need to crawl under a loading dock to get in here," Jake said. "I would have a key to the front door." Another pause, then the sound of footsteps coming closer. Jake kept his flashlight pointed down so he wouldn't blind her when she emerged from the shadows. A moment later, he saw her, small, blonde, probably in her early 30s, wearing a diner uniform and a terrified expression that was trying very hard to be brave. "Sarah," she said, not extending her hand but not backing away either. "Sarah Mitchell." "Jake Ramirez," he replied. "We need to get you out of here. The men who brought you here, they poured gasoline around the front entrance. They're planning to come back and set it on fire." Sarah's face went pale, but she didn't panic. Jake filed that information away under good signs. People who could process bad news without falling apart were easier to extract from dangerous situations. "I know," she said. "They told me. They said if my ex-husband doesn't pay them money he owes, they're going to burn the building down with me inside." "How much time do we have?" Jake asked, already thinking through exit strategies. They said 12 hours. That was about 2 hours ago. 10 hours. Plenty of time to find a safe way out, call the authorities, and make sure the people responsible were arrested. Jake felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. This was going to be a straightforward rescue operation, no time pressure, no complex variables. Then, Sarah's phone rang. She looked at the caller ID, and her face went white. "It's Marcus," she whispered. "The man who locked me in here." Jake gestured for her to answer, but to put it on speakerphone. If they were lucky, Marcus would give them some useful intelligence about his plans or timeline. Sarah's hand was shaking as she accepted the call. "Hello," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hello, Sarah." Marcus's voice was calm and professional, like a businessman discussing quarterly projections. "I hope you're comfortable in your new accommodations. I have some news about your ex-husband that I thought you should hear." "What kind of news?" Sarah asked. "The bad kind, I'm afraid. David seems to think that our arrangement is some kind of negotiation. He actually had the nerve to tell me that he doesn't have our money and can't get it by tomorrow night. Can you believe that? After we went to all this trouble to motivate him." Jake saw Sarah's face crumble and knew what was coming next. "So we've decided to move up our timeline," Marcus continued cheerfully. "Instead of waiting until tomorrow night, we're going to conclude our business relationship tonight. In about 30 minutes, actually. I hope you've used your time wisely to think about your life choices." The line went dead. Sarah looked at Jake with eyes that were bright with terror and tears she was refusing to shed. 30 minutes, she whispered. Jake was already moving, his mind shifting into the tactical mode that had kept him and his team alive through dozens of high-risk operations. 30 minutes wasn't much time, but it was enough. He'd extracted people from worse situations with less warning. "We're getting out of here," he told Sarah, his voice carrying the absolute certainty that came from 8 years of successful missions. "Right now." "But the gasoline," Sarah said, following him toward the loading dock. "If they see us trying to leave, they'll just light it early." "Then, we don't let them see us," Jake replied. "And we make sure they can't light anything even if they do." He led Sarah back to the loading dock, helping her through the gap under the roll-up door. Once they were outside, Jake pulled out his phone and made 3 calls in rapid succession. First to 911, reporting a kidnapping in progress and requesting immediate police and fire department response. Second to his old commanding officer, requesting emergency backup from any off-duty military personnel in the area. Third to his brother, who worked private security and owed Jake about a dozen favors. "What now?" Sarah asked, watching Jake work his way through his contact list. "Now we make sure Marcus and his friends have a very bad night," Jake said, checking the time on his phone. 26 minutes until the deadline. "And we make sure they never get the chance to hurt anyone else the way they hurt you." Sarah looked at him with something that might have been hope. "Are you a police officer?" "Something like that," Jake said, scanning the street for App. Marcus Chun had been in the intimidation business for almost 15 years, and he learned that there were 2 kinds of people in the world, those who folded under pressure, and those who folded under more pressure. Everyone broke eventually. It was just a matter of finding the right leverage and applying it correctly. Tonight's job should have been simple. Kidnap the ex-wife, make the threats, collect the money, eliminate the witness. Clean, professional, profitable. What Marcus hadn't expected was for David Mitchell to grow a backbone at the worst possible moment. Most gambling addicts were pathetic creatures who would do anything to protect themselves and their habits. They would sell out their own mothers for one more chance at the tables. David should have been begging to pay the debt, should have been desperate to save his ex-wife, and get back to his regular routine of losing money he didn't have. Instead, David had actually hung up on him, had told Marcus that he didn't have the money, couldn't get the money, and wasn't going to destroy his life trying to save someone who'd already divorced him because of his gambling problem. The conversation had lasted exactly 3 minutes, and David had spent 2 of those minutes explaining why Sarah's problems weren't his problems anymore. So now Marcus was driving back to the warehouse with Tommy and Rico, preparing to clean up a mess that should never have existed in the first place. They would light the building, watch it burn for long enough to make sure the job was finished, then drive away and never think about Sarah Mitchell again. By morning, there would be nothing left but ashes and A tragic story about a woman who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. You sure about this? Tommy asked from the passenger seat. He was young, new to the crew, still squeamish about the messy parts of the business. I mean, she didn't actually do anything wrong. This is all on her ex-husband. That's exactly why we're doing this, Marcus replied, checking his watch. 22 minutes since he'd called Sarah with the updated timeline. David needs to understand that his choices have consequences for other people. Next time someone in his situation gets in debt with our boss, they'll remember what happened to Sarah Mitchell. They'll pay up fast instead of trying to negotiate. But she has a kid, Rico added from the back seat. I saw the file. 5-year-old daughter. Marcus sighed. This was the problem with working with people who still had consciences. They made the work more complicated than it needed to be. The kid will be fine, he said. She'll go live with relatives or get adopted. Probably better off without a mother who married a gambling addict anyway. We're doing her a favor in the long run. Tommy and Rico didn't look convinced, but they didn't argue anymore. Marcus had been doing this long enough to know that moral objections usually disappeared once the money was divided up. Everyone had principles until it was time to pay rent. They turned onto Industrial Boulevard, and Marcus slowed the sedan to a crawl. The warehouse looked exactly the way they'd left it. Dark, empty, surrounded by the kind of urban decay that made perfect cover for activities that decent people preferred not to think about. The smell of gasoline was still strong near the entrance, which meant the accelerant hadn't evaporated. Good. It would light faster and burn hotter with the fumes still concentrated. Marcus parked the car in the same spot they'd used earlier, behind the dumpster where it couldn't be seen from the main road. He opened the trunk and pulled out a gas can, a box of road flares, and a small camera. The camera wasn't necessary for the job, but Marcus had learned that clients appreciated proof of completion. A few photos of the burning building would make the final invoice easier to justify. Tommy, you're on lookout, Marcus said, distributing assignments. Rico, you're with me. We light the front entrance, take some pictures for the client. Then, we're out of here. 10 minutes max. What if someone sees the fire and calls it in? Tommy asked. Then, the fire department shows up and finds a tragic accident, Marcus replied. Old building, faulty wiring, these things happen all the time. That's why we used gasoline instead of something more exotic. Accidents are much more believable when you use common accelerants. They walked toward the warehouse, and Marcus felt the familiar calm that came with completing a job. In 10 minutes, Sarah Mitchell would be dead, and his debt collection problem would be solved. David would understand that some people couldn't be negotiated with, and future clients would be much more motivated to pay their debts on time. Everyone won, except for the people who lost, and they didn't really matter anyway. Marcus was pulling out the road flares when he noticed that something was wrong. The chain on the warehouse door was still in place, but it was hanging differently than when they'd left it. Looser, as if someone had been testing the lock or trying to see how much slack there was in the chain. Rico, he said quietly. When we left earlier, was the chain hanging straight down or at an angle? Rico squinted at the door, trying to remember. Straight down, I think. What? Marcus didn't answer. He was scanning the area around the warehouse, looking for signs that someone else had been here. Footprints in the dirt near the loading dock. Disturbed gravel by the side entrance. Small things, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Someone had been examining the building. Someone who knew enough about locks and security to test the entrances without actually breaking in. That suggested either law enforcement or someone with military training. Neither option was good news for Marcus and his team. Change of plans, Marcus said, putting the flares back in his jacket. We're going to check the building first. Make sure our guest is still where we left her. I thought you said the building was secure, Tommy said. It is secure, Marcus replied. But secure doesn't mean impossible, and I don't like taking chances when there's money on the line. They approached the front door, and Marcus examined the chain more carefully. It was definitely looser than it had been earlier, but the lock itself hadn't been tampered with. Either someone had tested it and given up, or they'd found another way inside. Marcus was betting on the second option. He pulled out his phone and called Sarah's number. If she was still locked inside the warehouse, she would answer. If she didn't answer, then they had a problem that was going to require a more aggressive solution. The phone rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. Marcus hung up and tried again. Same result. She's not answering, Rico said, stating the obvious. No kidding, Marcus replied, pulling out a pistol from his jacket. Which means either she's dead, unconscious, or not in the building anymore. Tommy and Rico both drew their weapons as well. This was no longer a simple arson job. This was a potential firefight with unknown hostiles in an urban environment. Marcus had been in this situation before, but never when he was supposed to be conducting a quiet cleanup operation. Spread out, Marcus ordered. Rico, you take the loading dock. Tommy, check the side entrances. I'll go through the front door. If you see anyone who isn't Sarah Mitchell, you shoot first and ask questions later. The men separated, each heading toward a different entrance to the warehouse. Marcus pulled out his key to the front door lock and tried to convince himself that there was an innocent explanation for Sarah's failure to answer her phone. Maybe she dropped it, or the battery had died, or she was unconscious from fear and stress. People did strange things when they were trapped and terrified. But Marcus hadn't stayed alive in this business for 15 years by believing in innocent explanations. His instincts were telling him that the situation had changed, and his instincts had never been wrong about danger. He unlocked the front door and stepped carefully through the gasoline-soaked entrance, trying not to breathe the fumes. The inside of the warehouse was dark and quiet, exactly the way it had been when they'd left Sarah there. But something felt different. The quality of the silence was wrong, charged with tension instead of the empty hopelessness he'd expected. Marcus activated the flashlight on his phone and started moving deeper into the building. Sarah, he called out. Sarah, we need to talk. Your ex-husband has decided that he doesn't care what happens to you. Time to discuss new arrangements. No response. Marcus moved forward, sweeping his light across the empty space, looking for any sign that Sarah had been there. After about 50 feet, he found what he was looking for, a small pile of debris near a rusted machine, arranged in a way that suggested someone had been sitting there for a long time. But Sarah herself was gone. Marcus pulled out his radio to contact Rico and Tommy, then stopped. If Sarah had escaped, she would have called the police. The building should be surrounded by now, filled with SWAT teams and negotiators. The fact that it was still roaching headlights. Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. When I tell you to run, you run. When I tell you to hide, you hide. When I tell you to get down, you get down immediately. Can you do that? Yes, Sarah said without hesitation. Good. Because we're about to turn this from a rescue operation into something else entirely. In the distance, Jake could see headlights turning onto their street. Marcus and his team coming back to finish what they started. Jake checked his watch one more time. 24 minutes. Time to remind everyone why they called him Ghost in the teams. Some people thought that nickname was about stealth, about his ability to move without being seen. Those people were wrong. Jake had earned that name because of what happened to the enemies who underestimated him. They had a tendency to disappear. Emma, probably fast asleep in her bed, expecting her mother to be there when she woke up. She thought about David and his stupid gambling problem that had somehow become her problem. She thought about how unfair it was that she was going to die in this horrible place because of choices that someone else had made. But then, she remembered something her father had told her years ago, when she was a little girl afraid of the dark. Being scared is okay, sweetheart. Being scared just means you're still alive. It's what you do when you're scared that matters. Sarah stood up, wiped her eyes, and started looking for another way out. She wasn't going to die in this warehouse. She wasn't going to leave Emma without a mother. She was going to find a way to survive this, no matter what it took. The warehouse was enormous, filled with shadows and forgotten machinery. But somewhere in this concrete maze, there had to be another exit. There had to be a way out that didn't involve walking through gasoline fumes toward men with lighters. Sarah just had to find it before her 12 hours were up. She started walking deeper into the building, her footsteps echoing in the darkness. Behind her, the smell of gasoline grew stronger, and she tried not to think about what would happen when Marcus decided that David had run out of time. Instead, she thought about Emma's laugh, and her bedtime stories, and all the things she still needed to do as a mother. She thought about how much she wanted to live, and let that want carry her forward into the dark.